Hello, it's David at DSES UK, and today I'm whittering on about the humble test and inspection notice as defined in Regulation 514.12.1. I'm going to cover here what I don't like about the thing and how I wish to see it changed when Amendment 2 plops into the litter tray in a few weeks from now. Indeed, the limitations of this label was something I lamented in one of my comments to the IET when the draft for public comment was open on Amendment 2 at the end of 2020. Do you think they listen to me or anyone else? Or will the requirements of 514.12.1 remain inadequate and unchanged when the IET shit out the expensive and appropriately coloured brown book next month? Yeah, I'm not a betting man, but my confidence is low that much will change with respect to this regulation. So let us explore why I have a bee in my ball bag about it and what I intend to do going forward, regardless of what the IET fling forth in Amendment 2. 514.12.1 pertains to the inspection and testing notice and reads, "Important! This installation should be periodically inspected and tested and a report on its condition obtained as prescribed in the IET wiring regulations BS 7671 requirements for electrical installations. Date of last inspection, recommended date of next inspection." Straightforward enough, despite being written in IET English, which is a tortured form of the everyday language the unwashed and increasingly dumbed down masses can relate to. But it's clear that your electrical installation ought to be periodically inspected and tested, and the date fields allow it to be shown when that last occurred and when it should next be undertaken. Or does it? Does this notice actually indicate anything of use at all? Assume we've just turned up to a site we've not been to before and find a shoddily installed grotty bird's nest of a consumer unit or distribution board with this notice and a couple of dates scrawled on. Let's assume there are no other identifiers or any paperwork for whomever has worked on this installation previously, which is common enough. The presence of this notice indicates one of four things. Number one, it applies to a change of consumer unit or DB or an additional one having been added. Number two, it applies to a full or partial rewire of the property. Number three, it applies to one or more new circuits only and not any wider work. Or number four, it applies to an inspection and testing having been undertaken and not any physical installation work at all. Already we're in the dark as to what this damnable notice is supposedly telling us about this installation, in the absence of any accompanying certificate or report that shares the date some asshole has scrawled upon it. We could go hunting for that information if there was anything on here requiring the person completing the notice to identify who they or their organisation are. But there isn't, so fuck knows who was wielding the pen when the date fields were completed. As this notice comes in sticker form with any new consumer unit, how do I even know it relates to any professional installation or reporting work at all? This installation could be a DIY effort, there being no inspection and testing having been performed in any way, shape or form. Joe Homebase could have picked up a replacement consumer unit from Screwfix and bolted it to the wall without using any specialist equipment to check the adequacy of earth fault loop paths, insulation resistance, ring continuity, suppliers earthing, adequacy of protected devices and bonding arrangements, or anything else. Nonetheless, he's fished the sticker out of the box, put the day's date on it, and arbitrarily slapped on a future date, perhaps a whole decade away, because he's that sure he's aced the workmanship. After all, electrics is piss, as any pub loudmouth, plasterer or bathroom tiler will tell you. And that's the problem with an anonymous and ill-detailed inspection notice. If you don't know who slapped it on, what kind of work it relates to, and what level of professional competence they had, if any, then its presence can serve as a false sense of security. Someone renting a property might see this label affixed to the consumer unit and assume their landlord is on top of their electrical safety. Or someone might buy a new property and assume a label that's in date means it's been professionally checked over and needs no further checks anytime soon, even if the seller didn't hand over any related paperwork. The second issue here is with the recommended date of next inspection. If this notice is being applied on initial verification for new work, that's likely to be 5 or 10 years in England and Wales, depending on the nature of the property, unless there's a reason for a more frequent regimen, which may be the case in commercial installations. On a periodic inspection for an existing installation, however, we run into a problem. If the electrical installation is in such a dangerous state that one is required to mark it as being unsatisfactory for continued use, what date should then be entered into the next inspection field? Regulation 653.4 requires the inspector to make a recommendation supported by an explanation, and if we look at the model form for an electrical installation condition report in Appendix 6, it gives a caveat to the next inspection date, which reads, subject to the necessary remedial action being taken, I/we recommend that the installation is further inspected and tested by whenever. So in the event of an installation being deemed as unsatisfactory for continued use following inspection and testing, the date shown on the notice for the next inspection is what applies, only assuming the duty holder follows the recommendations on the report and bothers to do anything about them. Again, if you're a tenant or someone who has just become the duty holder for an electrical installation, perhaps because you've bought a new house and no related paperwork was handed over, you'd look at the next inspection date on this fucking notice and would assume all is well and no action is needed until sometime in the far distant future. But what this notice doesn't tell you is that the next inspection date only applies if the installation passed as being satisfactory for continued use, and if it didn't, then it's caveat emptor, motherfucker! It's this kind of ridiculum, overlooked for years, yet so easy to fix, which makes one wonder how fit for purpose the IET are to be sticking their short wick between the brown flaps of the new regs book. If these doddery old fuckers could put some thought into the thing instead of sitting in their Masonic lodge passing around the cognac, then street shitheads like me wouldn't have to pop up on YouTube pointing out the patently obvious. This notice is also to be applied where a new circuit has been installed. Let's say we're adding a new socket circuit to this consumer unit. The CU already has a notice which, for the sake of argument, relates to when it was installed. Our new circuit is required to be signed off on a certificate as required in section 644. The electrical installation certificate has a checklist asking for the presence of a periodic inspection and testing notice, and Regulation 514.12.1 states that this notice be fixed in a prominent position at or near the origin of every installation upon completion of the work. This means on or around your consumer unit there may be more than one of these notices, each with different dates. It's not uncommon to see one where someone has scribbled on something like Circuit 2 new kitchen socket circuit only, or DB2 only, or similar, to indicate that their label relates only to a new part of the installation that they have explicitly inspected, tested and certified, and that their last and next inspection dates don't relate at all to the wider installation. Still, there are no fields on the notice given in 514.12.1 to express this kind of useful and important detail, and reliance is on the diligence of any installer to take it upon themselves to volunteer that information. If another installer lacks such diligence, they may well slap on a sticker at source that relates only to the new work so that they can tick the box on the certificate to say this notice is present. But again, someone looking at this notice with no context would naturally assume it applies to the installation as a whole. A few years ago, recognising some of the deficiencies with this goddamn thing, I had a load of custom labels printed that went beyond what Regulation 514.12.1 asked for. A third field was added that gave a certificate reference. My company identification was provided, including contact details, and my NIC, EIC and ECA membership numbers, as relevant at the time, were provided. All well and good, and I still have a pile of these friggin' labels. However, I've now left the ECA, so their logo and membership number shouldn't be on my stationery anymore, which made me go back to the drawing board to design the ultimate, the daddy, the jutting cock and indeed wiry head balls of T&I labels. Oh yes! And here is the monster, and a hell of a size the bastard is too. But remember, it doesn't have to be on show, it can be placed inside the lid of a consumer unit if desired. I know some of you will cry about that and say it needs to remain visible, but I'd rather have it inside the lid where it remains available to the next person poking about than to slap it onto the outside where Jill or Jasmine, the homeowner, will peel it off for looking ugly. Let's cover the sections to show how this is totally badass. There's no change to the IET English at this time, and we still have a field for date of inspection, albeit slightly reworded, as 514.12.1 words it as date of last inspection, but I see no reason to include the word last. As on my old labels, we have a field for giving the certificate or report reference that this notice applies to, and my company contact details are provided for any past clients to request a copy of that paperwork if they've mislaid theirs. It makes the dates and further information on this notice traceable and auditable. What's new though is the scope of inspection section, which gives information as to what this notice pertains to. As stated previously, it can only be one of four things: a replacement consumer unit or distribution board, or an additional one having been added, a partial or full rewire, a periodic inspection, or a new installation. That is to say, either wholly new, as you may have in, say, a new outbuilding that's been wired up, or one or more new circuits added to an existing installation. More than one field can be ticked, so we can have a partial rewire and new CU indicated, for example, and if we've added a new circuit or secondary consumer unit, we can state what that is. Condition of installation is an important field missing from the current requirements of BS 7671. Obviously, for initial verification, it will always be satisfactory, otherwise no notice or certificate can even be issued. But on a periodic inspection, the inspector gets to state whether the installation on the day passes muster or not, and initialing the requisite field on the notice serves to identify who that inspector was in any given organisation. Of course, inspections always have some form of limitations, so where we're saying an electrical installation is safe for continued use, we do so with respect to the extent and limitations given on the report. Here, that's stated implicitly on the notice itself, because those who don't know wouldn't otherwise know. Similarly, if we're indicating that remedial action is now required to correct any shortfalls in the safety of the installation, we state on the notice that the duty holder, i.e. the homeowner or landlord, is now responsible for acting without delay on any danger issues highlighted in our report. We also make it clear that the next inspection date given is only valid where remedial work has been undertaken and has itself been certified. It's important that the certification is provided for any corrective work identified on any condition report, as the overall body of paperwork serves to show what the problems were, that they are now resolved, and who accepts the responsibility for the safety of the installation between the original inspector and the sparky who undertook the remedial work, especially if they're from different organisations. If I undertake an inspection, I accept the responsibility for the things I say have passed, but not for anything I've reported to the duty holder as a failure or that someone else has subsequently come along and fiddled with. If someone else fixes the things I say need fixing, but runs off without signing off what they've altered, then the best I can do is perform a re-inspection, charged for, of course, to see if the electrical installation is now satisfactory. But who am I to be performing this work anyway? There are plenty of installation electricians and downright fraudulent blaggers offering inspection and testing work when they're not insured, qualified or accredited to be doing such, and some of the comedy paperwork that they produce has been dissected on this channel and on my website in the past. Well, here's my fucking NIC-EIC registration number and the address of the Registered Competent Person website where the validity of my membership can be checked and where it can be verified that I am indeed rubber-stamped to be performing inspections in the first place. I recognise that this customised notice is, in pot noodle terms, a bit of a king-size Bombay bad boy, so to save a little sticker space, I've also slapped on the stupidity of Regulation 514.14.1, the two colours notice. Changes to this bollocks was another recommendation I made on the DPC for Amendment 2, which will likely be ignored. We're supposed to slap this damnable waste of sticky back plastic onto any installation that shares red and black conductors with the brown and blue we've been installing since the mid-noughties. It's a pointless label that needlessly fuglies up any installation and which basically says, in IET English, that you should correctly identify your conductors before working on an electrical installation. Isn't that part of your basic safe isolation and common operating procedure anyway? Isn't that something so patently shitting obvious that it doesn't need saying? I think the worry is that an electrician from foreign climes might come over here and be confused as to what they're seeing, but different countries have different rules, regs, voltages and ways of wiring quite outside of the basic core colours, and a better label would simply state, keep your fucking hands out of it unless you really know what you're doing, you kitchen fitter asshole. But for some reason we instead get this notice which says, in a fucktarded way, the colours you find here are different to what you may have seen in other territories. Well, duh. If you don't know the UK wiring colours pre and post harmonisation, you are, by the very fucking definition in Chapter 2 of BS 7671, not skilled to be getting up to your elbows in UK electrical installations, you tart. Why does any of this have to be stated on a bloody label? Fine, whatever. If Amendment 2 doesn't take my advice to drop this bullshit notice, here it is in slightly reworded small print on my own T&I label. It says, legacy installations may contain wiring colours to two versions of BS 7671 in a kind of covers my arse way that doesn't wholly comply with 514.14.1 and ends up slapped everywhere whether relevant or not. But it's stupid anyway. So fuck 'em. One of the drivers for my making this change is because I'm often too embarrassed to apply my custom label to consumer units I've inspected where the workmanship is shoddy as shit, or where old age and a lack of maintenance see something distinctly cranky hanging off the wall. My label may have been adhered to a CU on an installation I found to be unsatisfactory for continued use, simply to indicate when my inspection took place and when the next inspection ought to occur by, if all the observations of danger are corrected. But the duty holder may not bother acting upon my sage advice, and the next guy who comes along might assume that the shitty installation in front of them, with my name now slapped across it, is actually the result of my own work, or one that I passed off as being fit for purpose, despite obvious visible problems. Whereas if they'd got hold of the accompanying paperwork, they'd see I'd bitch slapped it down as a load of old wank that urgently needs sorting out. A customised label can almost serve to drag one into disrepute when it's applied to an installation of bad workmanship or poor maintenance, even though it relates to a report where such failings are catalogued. Because of this, I get a bit naughty on some EICRs performed on iffy installations, and I wholly omit the test and inspect notice entirely, because I don't want my company's drunken name publicly showing anywhere near the horror work of some amateur. The duty holder knows the inspection has been undertaken, and they have the paperwork, of course, but my old labels didn't always get slapped on unless we've undertaken remedial work, or if they do get stuck into place, I'd sometimes scrawl on the notice that it does not denote a pass and further work is required. My new layout, however, makes it clear at a glance to any interested party, be they a duty holder, tenant, another Sparky, or whomever, just where the installation stands. Eventually, I'll send it off to a printer to run off a bunch of good quality UV-resistant labels, but I'm waiting to see what Amendment 2 brings, as it's sod's law the IT English will be tweaked in some kind of useless, half-assed, fucked-up way that fails to address the underlying problems that daily affect those of us in the real world. I'm also open to any improvements you lot out there can think of. Drop me a comment on what you like, don't like, or would yourselves change. Who knows, maybe Amendment 2 will be a breath of fresh air rather than an eggy wet fart. I'll believe it when I've paid the best part of £100 to fucking read it. My thanks go to those of you who have contributed to the beer fund, and yes, Buy Me a Coffee is now Buy Me a Beer after I went on there and found you could customise it from the hot brown stuff to something amber with a foamy head. Far more appropriate. On the shout-out list today are Virgin, Steve J, John Townsend, Craig Tong at Smarter Home Electrics, and Steve from SLP Electrical. While the whores who can't get enough are Donovan's Alarms, security at its best, Andy Carouche, Andy Payne, Jim Hook in sunny Sydney, wish I was, Ben Robinson, the curiously named GR Electrical RH17, and the venerable Mr. Humbug. Shout out as well to Tim in Sheffield once more. Thanks for your letter, Tim. Amendment 2 lands in about 6 weeks, and I'll be going through to see what's new, as I'm sure will the likes of JW, Sparky Ninja and such, only they'll do it more professionally, of course. For now, though, thanks for watching.